Okay, welcome everybody, and I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Daniel Ryterband. Daniel and his wife Diane live in suburban New York City, where I presume he is today, and have three children. He's the chairman and chief executive officer of FW Cook & Co., which provides consulting services to corporate boards in the area of executive compensation, HR strategy, and corporate governance. The collecting side, he has numerous collecting interests, including US classics on and off cover, US Civil War postal history, US free francs, and early inland waterway covers. He maintains specialist collections of the US, the 1847 issue, the US 1930 Graf Zeppelin issue, which we're going to see today, and several other 20th century US issues. Dan's an avid exhibitor and has won many prizes and has formed many, as I said, award-winning 8-frame and single-frame displays. He's a member of the American Philatelic Society, the US Philatelic Classic Society, the Civil War Philatelic Society, the United States Stamp Society, the Club de Monte Carlo, the Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada, and several other specialist societies. Someone who probably belongs to as many philatelic societies as I do. Um, He's a fellow of the Royal, a governor of the Collectors Club in New York City, and a member of the Council of Philatelists at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum. Um, Last year, Dan very kindly came over to the Royal and gave us a 5 o'clock display. It was stunning, and for that, he won the Lee Medal this year. That was for the US Civil War display. Now he's going to show us his amazing US 1930 Graf Zeppelin issue, and I welcome you, Dan, and over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining. The first thing I should do here is share the document. So let's get into it. Some background first on the Graf Zeppelin, the airship itself. So it was quite a spectacle, 236 meters long. During 9 years of flight, it flew over 1 million miles on 590 flights. It carried thousands of passengers, hundreds of thousands of pounds of mail and freight. Never had an accident. Pretty amazing. But unfortunately, 2 days after the Hindenburg disaster in 1937, the service on the Graf Zeppelin was discontinued. It made its first commercial passenger flight across the Atlantic in October of 1928. The total flight hours to make that trip from Friedrichshafen. And I'm going to say that just once. I'm going to refer to it as Fried moving forward, since my New York accent doesn't really enable me to pronounce it properly. The total flight hours were about 111 hours from Fried to Lakehurst, New Jersey. Carried a crew of 40, 20 passengers. It's quite expensive to travel on the Graf Zeppelin, a $3,000 fee for the trip. Interestingly, ocean liners took about twice the time, typically 14 days. But this really wasn't about the time and the efficiency. It was more the unique nature of travel that attracted people, into this venue. I have collections of the 1928 and 1929 flights, also the 1930 and 1933 Chicago flight. The two that are most interesting to me are the 1930 and the 1933, which the U.S. Post Office produced its own stamps. The stamps were intended to partially finance the flight costs for the Zeppelin company, and very importantly, and we'll talk about this as we go through this presentation, to make a profit for the Post Office in the U.S. and elsewhere. So again, today's presentation is on the 1930 flight and the U.S. issued stamps. In 1930, the Graf, as it had become known, was scheduled to fly a triangular route from Fried to Brazil, then to Lakehurst, New Jersey, and then back to Germany. As it had with prior flights, the Zeppelin company established a very complicated set of rates. Interestingly, the majority of the postage would be paid to the Zeppelin company. So, for example, for the $2.60 rate, and I'll explain the rates in just a few moments, the German post office received only 5 cents, the U.S. post office received 40 cents, and the Zeppelin company received $2.15. So most of the cost of the transportation of mail, the value of that went to the Zeppelin company to offset the cost of the flight. But, and this is a very important point, the U.S. Post Office would receive all of the money for any stamps that were purchased by collectors and not used on mail. So they expected a substantial windfall, and that's why the U.S. Post Office participated in this. 3 stamps were issued in denominations of 65 cents, $1.30, and $2.60 that enabled the payment of any of the rates on the various flight legs. And interestingly, they produced only 1 million sets of stamps. This was, and I emphasize the word only because the post office concluded that 1 million sets was limited availability and that would persuade collectors to spend the $4.55 on a set of stamps that were issued during the height of the Great Depression. So in today's dollars, using a 3.5% inflation factor, that $4.55 was approximately $120 US dollars. So for comparison purpose, a box of breakfast cereal was 12 cents. A dentist working full-time earned approximately $6,800 per year, or on average, $131 a week. So a well-off dentist to buy a set of these stamps, in essence, was giving up a week's worth of pay. The first day of issue was the 19th of April in 1930. That occurred at the Philatelic Stamp Agency in the City Post Office in Washington, D.C., and 326 first day covers were prepared. So interestingly, only 326 first day covers. The post office obviously was expecting an influx of interest here, again, producing the 1 million stamps. A couple days later, on April 22nd, the sales commenced in 99 other cities across the United States. So here's the stamps. These are actually at the top, small die proofs, which were printed on white wove paper. There are 2 known sets. This is one of them. And at the bottom is a large die proof. There's a set of these that were given to Dr. Eckner, who is the commander of the airship. It is believed that only 2 large die sets were produced. This set is at the National Postal Museum as part of the Postmaster General's collection. I don't know where the other set is, so I don't have a set of the large die proofs. I'd like to have that set. I do own the ones at the top. The only item in this presentation that I'm going to show you today that I don't own is this large die proof at the bottom of the page. So stamp production and sale. So this is Scott numbers C13 through C15. The stamps were printed on a flat plate press with 200 subjects in the sheet, which were cut into 4 panes of 50. Very interestingly, at the time, all stamps that were produced on the flat plate ended up having straight edges, because when the sheet was cut into the 4 separate panes, the cutting mechanism created these straight edges. Because there was such a high expectation of demand for these stamps, the post office didn't want to waste any stamps. And as a result, there were no straight edges on these sheets. And I'll show you what the panes look like in just a moment. But interestingly, of the 1 million stamps that were printed of each of these 3 denominations, only about 7% were actually sold, and the remainder were destroyed. So the 65 cent depicting the Graf Zeppelin in green over the Atlantic Ocean, they issued about 93,500. The $1.30, about 72,500, and the $2.60 Zeppelin passing the globe in blue, about 61,000. Each had 4 separate plate numbers. And below at the bottom of this page are complete sets at the left in mint never hinged condition, and on the right in used condition, all graded superb 98 by the PSE in the States. So the plate block positions included both top and bottom, as well as right and left positions. They're typically collected in blocks of 6. So here's an example of a set of top and bottom. These images are at 80%. Each one of these has a Philatelic Foundation certificate, mint never hinged condition, and quite well-centered state. Here are examples of the right and left. Interestingly, when the news of the slow sales reached Washington, the postmasters knew that most of the stamps that had been produced, 1 million stamps that had been produced of each denomination, were going to end up being destroyed. So in an attempt to encourage collectors to spend the money and actually buy these stamps, the postmasters agreed to enable the local postmasters to actually pull the single stamps out of the sheets in the plate number position. So it's actually possible to collect all 4 plate positions for each stamp in every plate position, so 16 of each. At the left is a set of mint never hinged top plate number singles, and at the right is a set of used bottom plate number singles. So you might wonder how many of these I have, and I think the answer, if you ask my wife, would be way too many. Here is a picture of a pane of 50. This is the upper left pane of 50, and you can notice, you can see my cursor here, there are no straight edges. At the right and bottom, they're fully perforated. So in essence, these were produced, again, as I mentioned, without straight edges. First time it had happened in the United States on a flat plate press. Here is a upper right pane of 50 of the $1.30. And I'd note that any intact pane are quite rare, especially the $1.30 and the $2.60 values. Here's the $2.60. The total postage to buy a sheet of or a set of panes was $227.50. So again, using the same 3.5% inflation rate, that would have cost a quote unquote investor or collector almost $6,000 at the time, which was quite a significant amount of money. So again, I mentioned the dentist's salary, basically a year's pay on an after-tax basis to pay for something like this. But interestingly, any quote-unquote investors who bought and held these panes, they realized an excellent return. So in $20-25, let's say this set of panes cost $6,000. If you could find them, minimally it would cost about $100,000. So quite a return on investment. So here's the flight map. This is very interesting. So this blue line here is the steamship. So to be included in any leg of the flight, and I'll explain the legs in just a moment, the covers first had to be transported from the United States, where the mail was collected in New York, to Germany. And that transportation occurred by steamship. Any covers that made the round trip ended up having to come back to the States also by steamship. The black is the flight plan. So the flight commenced in Fried, Germany, then to Seville in Spain, then to 2 stops in Brazil, and then from here to Lakehurst, and then the last leg of the flight from Lakehurst back to Seville and Fried. So anything that was going to be returned to the United States, in essence, started here, made its way to here, went on the flight, and then came back to here, and then was reloaded onto the steamship and transported across the Atlantic Ocean back to New York or to Lakehurst, New Jersey, depending upon the ship's date of departure. So that is the flight map. Here's the flight schedule, and I won't bore you with the details of this, but I think the presentation will be made available. And if anybody's interested in each of the flight legs themselves, here's the distance in kilometers. Here's the time that it took for each leg. This is one of the steamers. This is the Albert Ballon. It carried 5 sacks of mail on May 30th. The New York carried 2 sacks of mail, and then the Olympic carried 1 sack of mail. Again, all of that mail was carried across the Atlantic. So here are the various flight legs, the rates, and then the census data that exists for both cards and covers that were carried on various legs. So from Fried to Seville, the rate for a card was 65 cents. The rate for a cover was $1.30. And there were 393 cards carried, 326 covers carried, and 719 in total. I won't take you through all of this detail since it's relatively self-explanatory, but it's important to note that Freed to Lakehurst, this is the route that, or the flight leg that carried on the first dispatch the most mail. So almost 14,500 cards and about 5,500 covers. On the second dispatch, so if we go back here, the second dispatch was mail arriving in New York or in Lakehurst and only making this leg from Lakehurst to Freed. That second dispatch was the majority of the mail. About 28,000 cards and covers in total were carried on just this one leg from Lakehurst to Freed on the second dispatch. And I'll explain what all that means in the next page. Interestingly, the $2.60 blue stamp is much less common in used condition because it wasn't needed on any of the cards. So again, looking at the rates, you can see that you'd be wasting money to use a $2.60 stamp on any card. And it was only necessary for covers that were carried on these three legs or on the round trip. Here's what the cachets look like. So this is the type 1 diamond cachet. Notably, you can see that it shows these dotted lines with the entire flight plan. The type 2 diamond cachet was used only for the second dispatch, and you can see it's missing all of the earlier flight legs and shows only the last leg from Lakehurst to Seville and then to Freed. All the flown covers generally receive this red German flight cachet, but there are examples that were carried and flown but are missing this, which are interesting. And any cover that completed the full round trip on the first dispatch received this purple hand stamp upon arrival either in Seville or Freed. And then there were covers that were returned to the United States. They were generally back stamped with a green Zeppelin receiver, either in Lakehurst if traveling on the first dispatch or in New York City with completing the round trip or sent on the second dispatch. So let's look at some of these covers. Here is an example of one of those 326 first day covers. And interesting, the 326 covers include very few that have all three stamps for the entire set. So this cover completed the full round trip. You can see this purple round trip cachet here. This is the type 1 flight cachet with the entire trip. Here is the German flight cachet. And here's the April 19th, 1930 Washington, D.C. First day cancellation. Here's another example of first day covers. The one thing I've never been able to figure out is whether or not these count as 3 of the 326 first day covers or whether this set counts as 1. These are actually quite rare, but these were not actually flown. So they lack all of the markings, the type 1, type 2 flight cachet, as well as the German and any of the other flight cachet markings. So these actually were not flown, but they are a matching set of first day covers sent registered mail to Bloomfield, New Jersey. So my collection includes lots of first day covers and cards that were carried on each leg of the flight, including some of the rarest ones. So the next pages illustrate some of the most interesting covers. Here's one, $1.30 on an Elliott FDC, Lakehurst to Freed on the second dispatch. So again, you can see the type 2 flight cachet here. The second one on the bottom is a $2.60 Elliott FDC, so kind of a comparable cover to the top one. This is from Freed to Lakehurst on the first dispatch, paying the $2.60 rate. And again, you can see the type 1 flight cachet here versus the type 2 here. This FDC flight card bears this very rare Dr. Eckner label. I've seen a handful of these labels. This one actually happens to be tied by the Graf Zeppelin receiver marking here, which typically would have been placed on the back of the card, but in this instance was placed on the first. It's also tied by the Type 1 flight cachet with the $1.30 paying the appropriate rate. So as I mentioned before, Dr. Eckner was the Zeppelin company commander, and he was the most successful airship commander in history. So this is quite an interesting card. It's the only one I've ever seen like it. I'm guessing there may be another one or two of them out there, but I've always found this to be fascinated with the Dr. Eckner label tied. Here's a couple FDCs, both from Freed to Lakehurst on the first dispatch, each properly franked with the correct $2.60 rate. These are actually quite rare. So again, there's only 326 or so first day covers that exist. These on these red, gold, and black bordered envelopes that were prepared by various organizations make them extraordinarily important and desirable if you're a collector of this 1930 Graf Zeppelin stamps. Here's a few more. Again, these are bearing these silver Zeppelin pictures. The one at the top, $2.60 on an FBC, tied from Washington, D.C., and the first day slogan cancel. The one on the bottom, also tied on April 19th, but lacking the first day slogan cancel and instead having this duplex marking with 5 and the Washington, D.C. CDS. This one I acquired, I thought was the greatest Zeppelin cover I'd ever seen. It's unique. This was flown Freed to Freed on the first dispatch. It completed the round trip. So you can see the round trip marking down here. It has all of the appropriate flight caches, and it bears a complete set of plate number blocks of 4. I wish it had plate blocks of 6. I'm not sure that it would have fit on the cover with all of the rest of the information. The total postage of $18.20 overpaid the $3.90 rate for this leg of the flight by $14.30, or basically almost 5 times what the required postage was. Again, if you kind of adjust this for 3.5% inflation, somebody basically paid almost $500 in today's currency to send this cover and acquire this piece of philatelic property. Here's another one. Again, as was mentioned at the very beginning, all of this is in essence philatelic mail. I do have some examples of some commercial mail franked with the Zeppelins, but they're quite rare and a lot less interesting. Here's one that somebody put together. It bears 2 of the small banknote issues from the 1890s, a Trans-Mississippi stamp, a 75% parcel post stamp, which even though this was not a parcel, it was valid for postage, a 16-cent airmail stamp, which was the first U.S., well, it wasn't the first U.S. airmail issued, but it is cataloged as such in the stock catalog. And then, of course, this pair, the vertical pair of the $1.30 stamp with the plate number at the top. So again, kind of a neat way to put this whole thing together. And it's overpaying the $3.90 letter rate by 15 cents. This one is not in the greatest of condition, and maybe I should try to clean this up a little bit around the edges, but it's quite interesting because it bears every airmail stamp that was issued in the United States up to the date that the Graf Zeppelin stamps were issued on April 19th of 1930. So here you can see the first 6 airmails. Here's 7, 8, 9. Here's 10. Here's 11. Here's 12. And then the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And it also bears these 2 commemorative stamps that were issued in 1928 to honor the first flight. So these are known as the aeronautic commemoratives of 1928. So Again, this is unique. I've never seen another one like it. And it does have a little bit of damage around the edges. Another interesting cover. This one sent from the Naval Department via Graf Zeppelin from Lakehurst to Seville. There's two elements of this that are quite interesting. The first is that this strip of 7 of this 5-cent definitive coil stamp is the largest known multiple on cover for that particular stamp. I'm certain that when this was prepared, nobody cared about that, and it probably bears no real interest today. What really makes this interesting is that this cover is signed by 15 future crew members of the ultimately doomed Hindenburg airship. You can see all the signatures around the cover. So again, philatelic, but probably more interesting to autograph collectors than it would be to postal historians. Another unique cover, why somebody would have prepared this and structured it the way that they did, hard to imagine, but there's 4 $2.60 stamps, 4 $1.30 stamps, 165, and then these two commemoratives from the late 1920s. I have no idea why these were put on there. Obviously, none of this paid a specific rate. We're overpaying the flight leg rate by $15. So there was no need to put these on there. And I've spent some time trying to think about, well, why would these two particular commemorative stamps have been selected? One is honoring Charleston, South Carolina. I forgot what the other one is, and I can't actually read it on my screen. But I haven't been able to come up with any theories. Maybe it was just a coincidence. They wanted a little bit more color, or maybe there was a purpose to all of this from a personal perspective based on who prepared it. These are interesting in the sense that they were attempted catapult covers, meaning that they were flown on the trip, and then ultimately there was an attempt to have them sent by air, but by plane, not by the Graf Zeppelin. I say they're attempted catapult covers because here there's 2 copies of the $1.30 paying the correct letter rate for Freed to Rio, but it was insufficiently franked for the 15-cent catapult fee. So because that was missing, they actually were not sent on the catapult flight. Same thing here, paying the correct rate for the Zeppelin carriage, but didn't pay the 15-cent catapult fee. So you can see this marking down here, and there's the same on this one. The 15-cent fee wasn't provided, and as a result, they were not sent by catapult. Here's an example of one that was a successful catapult. So this is frankly the $2.60 stamp. That was the right letter rate for Freed to Lakehurst on the first dispatch, plus the additional stamps that were added after the flight to pay the postage and the catapult fee for the ship-to-shore final delivery in Germany. So this cover, its journey is quite incredible. So first it traveled by steamship across the Atlantic to Freed, where it was loaded onto the Zeppelin, and then flown to Lakehurst, New Jersey, where it arrived on the 30th of May in 1930, and then delivered to its initial destination at the Savoy Plaza Hotel in New York City on June 2nd. From there, it was sent via the SS Bremen to the Excelsior Hotel in Germany, shipped to shore via the SS Bremen, in essence, carried across the Atlantic. An airplane was catapulted off the ship, flew into Germany, landed, and then this entered the German mails and was ultimately delivered to its final destination. So quite a journey. Amazing that something like that could have happened. A feat of technology in itself. Not every cover that was received, despite incredibly detailed instructions from the Post Office Department, were properly franked for their rates. So here's one that was franked with a $1.30 Zeppelin stamp for the card rate for Freed to Lakehurst on the first dispatch, but it was upgraded to the $2.60 letter rate because it was an oversized postcard and therefore hand stamped in purple. Here you can see postage due $1.35, so the proper rate would have been $2.60. The extra 5 cents is the 5-cent penalty for being under franked. And on the back of this cover, so here's the 5-cent penalty. On the back of this cover are 13 and 10-cent postage due stamps, indicating that ultimately the proper postage was paid on this cover. You can see over here the tail of the Zeppelin receiver, meaning that it did make it. And on the other side, you can see the full Zeppelin receiver here and here. So also very interesting, not all of the mail that was supposed to be sent by steamship across the Atlantic made it to the proper destination on time. So covers and cards that arrived in Lakehurst after the second dispatch, which set sail on June 3rd, were hand stamped and delivered to the addressee via regular rather than Zeppelin post. And they were marked that they were too late and therefore didn't actually make the flight. So this one here showing this purple too late New York Post Office Barrack Street marking. This one here with a slightly different marking, received too late for the Graf Zeppelin dispatch. Again, these were covers or cards that were expected to be flown on the Zeppelin, but because they didn't arrive in time to be loaded onto the steamship, never made it. The last pieces that I'll cover are what I find to be the most fascinating of all of the 1930 Zeppelin mail. These are covers and cards that have the frankings and stamps of multiple countries. So to me, these are, they're all rare. They're quite interesting, and they can kind of tell you the mindset of the people who were either traveling on the Zeppelin themselves, and I'll show you some covers that were hand stamped and franked along the flight at various legs by people who were on board the airship, as well as people who were just interested in the flight itself for historical purposes and philatelic purposes. So this cover here originated in the Honduras, and you can see these Honduran stamps covering the postage to get to wherever it was that this cover ended up being loaded onto the airship. And the $1.30 stamp here, that was added to pay the letter rate for Lakehurst to Freed on the second dispatch. So again, I mentioned before, at least a few times, that the last leg of the flight was just that one trip from Lakehurst to Germany. The second dispatch, when all the mail was then offloaded from the airship and then placed back either into the German postal system or sent back to New York via steamship. So this one is a two-country franking. Here's one from Canada. So just as the Graf Zeppelin was quite a spectacle in the United States, it was the same in Canada, and the Canadians posted letters via New York City for carriage aboard the airship. This cover originated in Vancouver with the 15-cent Canadian postage, with 10-cent green and the 5-cent brown. And then sent by airmail to New York, where the $2.60 stamp was added to pay the letter rate for Freed to Lakehurst on the first dispatch, and then returned to Vancouver by airmail to the sender addressee following arrival in Lakehurst on May 31st. So again, a two-country franking, the United States and Canada. Here's a three-country franking. So this cover originated in Berlin, in Germany, with two copies of the German Zeppelin stamps here. That was canceled on May 19th and May 25th. The cover was then flown to Seville, Spain, where additional postage was added. You can see these Brazilian stamps here, and the Brazilian Graf Zeppelin stamp here. And then ultimately to Lakehurst, where the $1.30 Graf Zeppelin stamp was added on board the airship to pay the letter rate for Lakehurst to Friedrichshafen on, again, the second dispatch. So a three-country franking. And you can see the type 2 flight cachet here, just showing the Lakehurst to Germany leg. And then, of course, all these other markings for postage in both Germany and Spain, as well as obviously the postage in the United States on the last leg of the flight. Here's another three-country franking. This one shows the Type 1 flight cachet. You can see the two stripes of the purple round trip being stamped right here, meaning that it made the complete flight. This cover originated in Liechtenstein and made the complete round trip. So you can see these Liechtenstein stamps up here, paying the postage to Germany and then canceled with CBS markings on May 15th. The cover was loaded onto the airship and then departed freed on the 18th of May. The Brazilian Zeppelin stamp right here was added on board and canceled in Pernambuco, and then arriving in Lakehurst, where the $1.30 Zeppelin stamp was added to pay the letter rate for the second dispatch, Lakehurst to Freed. So interestingly, the cover did make the round trip and therefore got the Flight 1 cachet, but postage was only paid in the U.S. for the last leg, Lakehurst to Friedrichshaven, and the remainder of the postage was paid in the various countries where these stamps were added. This, I think, is the greatest of all Zeppelin covers. It's certainly the greatest one that I've ever seen. It's a 4-country franking. It's unique. Here you can see the complete set of Brazilian Zeppelin stamps. So the blue, the red, the green. Here's the German Zeppelin stamp. Here's the complete set of the US Zeppelin stamps. There's some Spanish stamps up here, some other Brazilian stamps up here. The cover is addressed to Max Pruss, who is the navigator on the 1930 flight and ultimately became the commander of the Hindenburg when it crashed in 1937. He was at the helm. This cover originated in Germany and was franked with the stamps of all 4 countries that were involved in the flight. So it's the only one I've ever seen. It was a souvenir that was prepared by the navigator on the flight. So at each various stop, he added the stamps. He made sure that they were properly canceled. All of the appropriate flight markings, including the round trip, purple round trip here, the Flight 1 diamond cachet here, the German Zeppelin cachet here. Paying all the postage, so basically a complete set of the Zeppelin stamps for 2 countries, the German Zeppelin stamp. Again, just an amazing thing. I've never seen another one like it. It's actually quite large. This image is presented at 75% on the sheet, so this is an 8.5 by 11 page. Basically, if it was at 100%, I could show you the cover, but I wouldn't be able to tell you all this neat information. In my last page, philatelic fakery, interestingly, the popularity of the U.S. Zeppelin stamps exploded after the stamps had been destroyed. So I mentioned that only about 7% of the issued stamps were actually sold to the public. Once the remainder, the 93%, were destroyed, interest in the Zeppelin issue, of course, continued thereafter. I have all the written records from the Postmaster General's files, and there's many letters sent by various people, either collectors or just people who are interested in the airship, or dealers petitioning the post office to reissue the Zeppelin stamp so they could buy them at the post office for face value. Of course, for the obvious reasons, that never happened. It's interesting to see the logic that various people had presented in support of their case that the post office should issue the stamps. But because the stamps were actually quite expensive, as collector demand began to increase afterwards, there were some attempts to actually fake the stamps, not to use on mail and defraud the government, but to defraud collectors. So here are 2 large die proofs of a couple of one of those attempts to defraud collectors. I've seen these in different colors. I also have a black one, a green one. I think there's a violet one. So here's a red orange, and here's a kind of a blue one that's similar to the color of the actual stamp. Here's the genuine stamp at the bottom of the page, and here are the fakes. So these, it's not 100% certain who produced these, because there were various forgers who were operating at the time. It's believed that these came from Italy, And you can see that there are some differences in the actual stamp versus the fakes. Obviously, the fakes aren't anywhere near as robust, and perforations aren't exactly the same. But you can see if you study it carefully that there are some noticeable differences. And that really is it. I can open up for questions, and happy to take any and all.
That was absolutely fantastic, Daniel. There's always been a mystique around the Zeppelin stamps, which as you asked me the other day, did I have a Sarawak Zeppelin cover, or someone did, and there are two exist, uh, both awfully philatelic, but I don't own either of them, even though I have a fantastic airmail collection. Uh, what I particularly like, the cancels are so fantastic. Nowadays, if you put something in the post and the cancel's not quite right, the postman just puts a felt tip right across all the stamps. But the care taken with some of those frankings are quite remarkable. Um, my last thing is before I open the floor to other questions, that cover where you had all the different airmail stamps from the US, were they all extant when they were put on the airmail envelope, or had they been demonetized?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Were they still in usage at the time, or had they been demonetized?
Well, they've not been demonetized. You can actually take Zeppelin stamps now, and they're still valid for postage. It wouldn't be a good investment to do that, but I will tell you this. I have I have this kind of fun collection of express mail covers that bear the eagle. Matter of fact, when we were at the I'm sorry, in Monaco together, Simon, and we had that event where the significant others painted pictures of people.
Your wife, Diane, did the eagle. Yeah.
My wife did the
$5
eagle. And that eagle stamp actually is, obviously it's from the like late 1900s, 1990 or 1980 or something like that. And it bears no value, but I have a collection. I probably have, I don't know, 100 first day covers, all hand painted. And on one of them, it actually has not one of these Graf Zeppelins, but the 50-cent Chicago Zeppelin paying the postage along with the express mail. So again, it's still valid for postage. It wouldn't be a good use if you were sending commercial mail, but I have seen a handful of instances where the stamp was used well after the remainders were sent back to the post office and destroyed. And in my collection, I actually have maybe maybe three covers or cards that were actually sent commercial mail with the 65-cent stamp paying a portion of the postage.
Wow.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
And obviously happened shortly after the stamps were continued because within just a few years thereafter, they started to ascend in value or appreciate in value.
So what can one say about other Zeppelin routes is the question.
Oh gosh, I mean, it's a whole body of collecting. I'm not an expert on the other Zeppelin routes. Obviously there's thousands and thousands and thousands of Zeppelin covers that people collect, a variety of different areas and purposes. My focus has been solely on the 1928, 1929, 1930, and 1933 flights that involve the U.S. But obviously, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the Zeppelin flew over 1 million miles, the Graf Zeppelin, and there were other airships owned by the German Zeppelin company, including the Hindenburg. So that's another body of collecting. So there are huge numbers of people who are focused on these areas and have great expertise in either specific countries or the Zeppelin itself and all of the various flights and routes. There's whole books that are produced on this. Matter of fact, I think I own, well, there's 2 catalog books, and then I own all kinds of auction catalogs, people who have prepared specialized collections. So there's a huge body of knowledge that exists out there around this type of mail.
Yeah, I mean, the one that I can think of, you mentioned the book, of course, it's the one that Cheryl Gantz has written. Now, she focused on the Hindenburg, I think, but still, that is an example of one of the Zeppelins, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I see a
Yeah.
question here about how did I know the Brazilian stamps were added on board the Graf Zeppelin? The answer is that you can figure out whether the stamps were potentially added on the Graf or elsewhere, depending upon whether or not the airship made a stop and actually enabled people to embark onto the airship. So if generally speaking, you have to look at the time that the airship was present. Was there an opportunity to do it? So it's possible that it could have been done while the ship was tethered and on the ground. But generally, there wasn't sufficient time to go to a post office and have it marked. So the Zeppelin itself, the Graf Zeppelin, actually had an onboard post office, just like Navy ships, for example.
Yes, they did. Yeah, the Zeppelins had a mail room, as it were, a post room.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people could basically, while they're on the ship, they could post mail, and then, believe it or not, they would drop it out the window down to the ground in a bag, and then it would enter into the postal system at various points of along the way.
Hmm.
It must have been quite a spectacle. There goes the mail
Yeah.
out the window.
It happens on warships the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they don't
Anyway,
drop into the water, but
Yeah.
yeah. Well, hopefully you've seen Norman's comment there, where he's found this fascinating as he collects German stamps. He knew of the flights, but has never studied them or collected the covers. So there we are. Yeah, no, you're right. It's a fascinating area, isn't it, of stamp collecting in this regard, for the ones that we used for these
when I was a kid and started
flights.
collecting around, I don't know, the age of 7 or 8, I remember attending my first stamp show with my father and seeing a set of these stamps and wondering why would the government have made stamps with Zeppelins on them. I, of course, already knew what a Zeppelin was, and I was kind of fascinated by the concept and the scale and the size of the airship itself and how it had traveled. So I desperately wanted to acquire these Zeppelin stamps, but of course they were way out of reach for a young boy. My father wasn't going to buy me a set of these stamps because it was quite expensive for him as well. And I had lost interest, like maybe many of us, in collecting probably around the age of 15 or 16, where other things began to occupy my mind, sports, girls, things like that. And I stopped collecting. And then an interesting portion of the story, actually, there's two pieces of the story. One is that when I was in the 4th grade, I sold the entirety of my baseball card collection, including my cousin's collection, because he had gifted it to me. And I used the proceeds of this to buy one single stamp. It was the 50-cent 1933 Graf Zeppelin. And I still own that stamp today. I think I paid $65 for it, and today it's probably worth $30. So I've had that stamp for well, on 50 years. That hasn't been a good investment. If I'd had those baseball cards, they'd be worth an awful lot more than that $30. But another funny story is that my father, who was a scientist, had retired from his job as an analytical chemist and decided that he and one of his pals were going to become part-time stamp dealers as kind of a hobby business. So my wife and I were living in Scarsdale, New York, in Westchester County, right outside of New York City. And my father and his friend Al were at a stamp show about a 10-minute drive from my house in White Plains, which is a big city in not too distant from our home. So I decided I was going to go see him. I think I was 26, 27, maybe 28 years old. I forget exactly how old I was, but I was going to go visit him. And I walked into the stamp show, and there were all the same dealers that I had known when I was a kid. Of course, they were 10 or 15 years older at this time. And I walked around the show, and of course, at this point, I had a job, I had a house, I had a wife, we had a child. I walked around the show and I realized, I can afford some of these things. Not all of them, but a couple of them. So I bought myself the 65-cent Graf Zeppelin stamp that I just presented. And I brought home and I brought it home and I showed it to my wife. And she looked at it and she said, "You actually paid money for that thing?" And I
Very
laughed
good.
and I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, how much?" And I remember this distinctly because now I was embarrassed. It cost me $210.
Oof.
And she looked at me and she said, "Is there going to be more of this?" And I said, "I don't think so. I wanted one of these since I was a kid. I have it now. It's kind of a souvenir. And that's that." So at the holidays, my father decided there was going to be more of this. And he bought me a set of Scott National albums and a bunch of airmail stamps. And when I opened up the gift under the, when we were all together for Christmas, my wife I saw the look on her face, and it was one of those "oh no" looks. She knew that this might be the start of something significant. So here we are,
Very good.
all my collections, traveling all over the world. But I would tell you now that she's glad that there was more of this.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's when your wife starts talking as a note of currencies and stamps. As you know, I'm coming to see you guys in America in a few weeks' time, and I happen to say to Claire, "This is a very expensive dinner by the time you're out in the flight."
Mm.
And do you know the response I got? Sell a cover.
Ah. Anyway, Simon, I think that Les would like to ask a question. Les, have you got a question for
I was just going to tell Daniel that when I was in high school, I had a history teacher. His name was Alfred Bacher, and he had been an Austrian trying to get out of Europe before the Second World War. And his Austrian passport was declared invalid in Italy. He had to go back, and he was drafted into the Luftwaffe ground support.
Oh,
And
gosh.
his first job was to dismantle the two Graf Zeppelin in the shed at
Friedrich?
Frankfurt,
Yeah.
and he had these great
Okay.
little 1.5 by 1.5 inch black and white pictures of them taking apart the Zeppelins.
Yeah, there's a whole, that's a great story, a really amazing story, because of course they used all of the infrastructure from the Zeppelin for war-related activities. So nothing went to waste. So they didn't just destroy these things and melt them down. They used so the difference between a blimp and a Zeppelin is that a Zeppelin has a rigid inner structure, and a blimp is like a big balloon.
Yeah, that's right.
So the Zeppelin obviously had substantial value when it was disassembled. I forgot the exact term for that, but they had a lot of residual value. And there are whole collecting areas related to Zeppelins of just the original photographs. So the Zeppelin being assembled, the Zeppelin in flight, the Zeppelin at various places, the Zeppelin then of course being disassembled for the scrap heap. But there are, again, those people collect items from the Zeppelin. So there were commemorative pins, some of the silverware and tableware still exist, and you can find these things in various auctions. I've never gone about buying like the coffee cup or a teacup or anything like that, but the thought has crossed my mind a couple times that maybe I ought to own one or two of these things and actually use them. But as I think Norman had mentioned, don't want to get hooked on these things because you already collect too wide a range. I think when you have the collecting bug, like all of us do, you go way outside of stamps into other areas, and then kind of go down the rabbit hole. So
Yeah.
a great story about the person who was drafted in and ended up. I'm sure that all that ended up becoming part of the Nazi war machine in the airplanes.
Yeah, probably.
Well, the Zeppelin continued to fly, in pieces even after it was disassembled.
Yeah. Simon,
Yes,
we do have a certificate of appreciation from the president.
yes.
Would you like me to put it on the screen?
If you could, please, and I'll officially thank Daniel.
Right, you are.
There you go.
Thank you.
Well, Daniel, you're getting a collection of these because, as I said, those of you who weren't at the beginning, Daniel very kindly came over and showed us his Civil War mail earlier on in the year, for which he received the Lee Medal for the best 5 o'clock display. And very grateful that you were part of my Zoom program. I thoroughly enjoyed that, Daniel. And those of you that know the routine, I've now seen it twice because I did the rehearsal and I found it just as fascinating the second time as I did the first time. Daniel, it was superb. Thank you very much for doing it. I know the time difference makes it difficult sometimes for our American cousins to do it, but well done indeed. And I know that everybody watching will thank you in the normal way. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for having me, everyone.